some of the Christians who were living to the north, who were not conquered by the Arabs, continued to resist Arab-Muslim culture because the Muslim army was stopped in a remote outpost. What was not significant to the Muslims, but was very significant from the point of view of Christian history, because Charles Martel was able to stop the Muslim armies in what we now call France, because the Muslims went all the way up, but they were checked back. And of course, the Christians were able to maintain control over northern Spain throughout that period when Muslims ruled. 700 years is a long time. You see, and they were able to resist. And of course, you have this back and forth fight. Now, the Muslims who were able to establish control over the Iberian Peninsula established themselves. You see, if you want to really understand what happened with the Muslims and the Christians in Spain, the closest analogy I can think of in my reading of history is China and the British Empire. The British were able to control Hong Kong, but they were never able to conquer the Chinese. You see? So Hong Kong, Singapore, all those became Chinese piece of land which were controlled by the British Empire. But the British were never able to conquer these Chinese. The moment the Chinese get strong, they'll kick the British out of these areas. And that's what happened with the Muslims. The Muslims were able to control southern Spain. They were able to control southern Spain, what we now call southern Spain, and establish their culture there. But they were not able to conquer the northern part of Spain, where the Christians continued to resist for a long time during that period of time. And of course, gradually the Christians will begin to capture these piece of state, real state. Now, what is very interesting, and this is a very important point to bear in mind, is that when the Muslims conquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, they were able to rule much of that land they conquered as a single entity. But within a span of a century and a half, you witness fragmentation. And this would be the source of disunity and later the collapse of Muslim power in the Iberian Peninsula. Because so long as the Muslims were united and they controlled the single entity, they were able to resist the northern reconquest that was being attempted, even during the time of the Crusades. But you see, once the Arab rulers of these territories fragmented into small city-states, they became vulnerable. Because what happens then is you witness a new kind of diplomacy, very much like the diplomacy in Western Europe. Frenchmen fighting Germans, Germans fighting English, and you find different kind of alliances. The same thing happened with the Arabs. These different kingdoms that were created by the Arabs fighting each other. And some of them will align with some Christians against some Arabs, and then some Christians will align with Muslims against Arabs. So, I mean, you find it was not religion. They were personal interests, dynastic interests. They were fighting each other. Some Arab Muslims will align themselves with some Christians against some Muslims. Some Christians will ally some Muslims against some Christians. That was the game. That was what was happening. Now, of course, later on, when the ideology of the crusade developed, these dynastic and personal interests begin to be less and less. And now you begin to see polarization between Christians and Muslims. And of course, since these Muslim territories were now split into small kingdoms, it was just a matter of time that they would lose out to the determined effort of the northern Christians who were trying to recapture their land. And that is one thing that has to be understood. Otherwise, you don't understand why North Africa became Muslim and Arabic, and Spain, after 700 years, reverted to Christianity. Because the histories are different. In North Africa, the Arabs intermarry with the Berbers, just like they did in Spain. But the difference is, in North Africa, the whole piece of real estate was under Arab-Muslim control. Whereas in Spain, there was still land left for the Christian Spaniards to maintain their culture and their tradition and to resist, something that did not happen to the Berbers in North Africa. That's a point which has to be emphasized when you make a comparison between North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The other point that needs to be borne in mind is that the Iberian Peninsula was linked to the rest of Europe, which was still Christian. The Berbers didn't have that. There was no other Berber land. All of Berber land was now Islamized and Arabized. That also becomes a very important point to take into account with regard to why after 700 years, it's like America. After 700 years, I don't think the Native Americans are going to come back here. I don't think so. So I don't think that's going to happen. So I mean, you know, like if you do comparative historical studies of civilization, because the local groups don't have any basis to come back to wage an offensive, to take back their land. It didn't happen. But that happened in the Iberian Peninsula. In the Iberian Peninsula, the northern part of Spain was still Christian, and they were engaged in a reconquest. And of course, from the 11th century, we see gradually attempts at recapturing. One by one, many of these kingdoms fell into Christian hands, Seville, and as you go down the line, until you come to 1492, and the last stronghold, just like Hong Kong and the British, fell. And of course, they took back their land. So I mean, like, this is precisely what happened in Spain. If you really want to look at Spanish history from a world history point of view, and you look at comparative perspective. Now, it is against this background of give and take, conquest and reconquest, that you can understand what was happening. Now,